Okay, so we're going to talk about the scene setup next for these three scenes that we were looking at earlier on for the asset creation. So we're going to look at the this first one, which is the rooftops, which we're going to kind of look at some camera projection, how to set that up properly, and just general composition and then post-production on that one. We're talking a little bit about render settings for the still image workflow here, not delving in too deep. And then we'll be looking at the kind of scene setup for the underwater rock scene. So we'll be looking at the underwater HDRI that we used, as well as the creating that mass of coral and foliage at the base, and the position of the kind of proxy base meshes for the rocks. And also in this one, we'll probably do a little bit of work with caustics, not with rendered in, but through projection again. So caustic projection through lights. And then in this one, we'll be talking about the several different setups that were involved in producing the poster image, basically, because this wasn't just one scene, this was a collection of scenes that were composited together. And one by one, we'll be doing the post-production for all three as well. So we're looking at how it got from this base render to this post-production, this composition to this one, and likewise with these ones. But we'll do them one by one through the composite and rendering to the post-production for each one separately. Okay. So let's get rid of this and let's load our our rooftop scene. So let's load our camera file. Let's also load another Mac so we can load some of the model files separately. And typically we work with camera files which only has the model in. The opposite, only has the lighting in, and then everything else is kind of XREF'd in different ways. But I think this one has the base geometry of the projection in as well. So we can see here the challenge with this shot was we started off with a kind of already distorted footage. It wasn't something we could kind of camera match in a kind of normal way. 2012 has some nice work. 2012 onwards had some nice camera projection match things that it can do quite automatically. Whereas this is a kind of distorted image from three separate images that we took, and we've composited this separately as one image. So that's what we're starting with. So we're already starting with a distorted image, which is a little bit tricky. And the final result isn't true to life. There'd be probably more warpage to what we've kind of shown, but essentially what we tried to do was build a scene. If I can go into this. It's a heavy file, but it's not unusable. Once the file is loaded, it kind of works fine. So what we've got here is camera projection, and we can see that kind of like distorting when we get out of our camera view. And if we turn off our XREFs, we can see that in the camera file, all we've got is a light over there. It's just a single dome that's lighting the scene, and then we've got some base geometry and a background image. Basically, that's all we've got. So the kind of first step, I'll just show you how the kind of scene was generally created. Again, if you look in 3D view, there probably isn't a huge amount of accuracy to this model true to the photograph, but when you go into, let's just load another one here. Let's look at the camera. when you kind of see it from the camera's perspective, it works, and that's all that matters for this kind of scene. We're not moving the camera. You can move the camera with this setup, but you'd be limited to the amount that you can actually move through it. So this was kind of created very loosely from the camera view, just by simple box modeling and moving it roughly into place to where it kind of matches the camera view. I think we started with a rough scale so that all of our lighting and shadows would be an estimated scale. So that we were working roughly in the right scale to how the buildings were. But it's just all this is simple box modeling, which has been kind of edited to kind of roughly fit the photograph. And you can see, I mean, if we were doing this for production for a visual effects, we'd probably be a bit more detailed, and we'll see that. We'll see that tomorrow when we export our track with the street scene. But for this, we didn't really need to be that accurate. We could even make this more accurate now by lining up some of these things a little bit more accurately for the view, getting the lines to kind of line up a bit more. And if you really go into detail and have a look, there's this object here could have been modeled with more detail. But because we knew we were covering this quite heavily with our elements, we didn't want to go too detailed too soon with any of the kind of base geometry until we'd got our stuff in there and realised what wasn't working, basically. So we felt like this was enough, especially for the artwork phase. But if we look at the material for this, let's just let this load. So that we can kind of quickly set up this projection very quickly. Let's just, oops. Let's get this to be, So what we're going to do is we're going to apply a camera map per pixel modifier to the geometry. We're going to clone our camera, and we're going to use that camera to project through onto the geometry. And the material we want to work with here is, if we can find it in our scene, if we just swatch any of these buildings, we'll see we've got this material here. And in the diffuse of that, we've got a camera map per pixel modifier. So we got that here. So if we rebuild this, if we just have a blank material, which we'll apply to everything, all the geometry at least. So, and we also, so in the diffuse, let's add that camera map per pixel and see what it's all about. So it's pretty straightforward. All we need to do is link it to a camera, and what we've got here is two cameras. One is our projector and one is our actual camera. And for the sake of, we could have made one camera for this scene, but the benefit of it is this allows us to be able to move our kind of rendered camera a little bit if we wanted to, and just it's good practice to have a separate camera projection camera, basically. So let's have a look. Let's ungroup this. That's not grouped. So if we add our projector camera to the camera map per pixel, so it says projector there, and then we find our texture, which is located within our texture slot here. So for ease, we'll just copy this in, paste it in there. And then, so that's our material. And we can, edit this material to be whatever we want outside of that diffuse. We don't really need to play around with reflection or bump mapping or anything like this for the projection, because because all of that light data is already created from the natural photograph. So you don't need to, it's just a diffuse flat material you want to create. You don't have to create it more complicated than that. You can mask it in different ways and things like that. But we don't really need to do anything more than that. And now on our geometry, what we've got is a camera map binding space warp, which you'll find here is our world space modifiers. So it's camera map. And then again, all we need to do there is pick our camera, which is our projector, to to link the material, to link the camera in the material and linking the camera in the geometry. So then when this material is applied, if we just select one or two of the objects, we'll apply this material to here and to here and here. We'll display it in the viewport. Actually, we've applied it to the whole thing, haven't we? So we'll just apply this to only a few objects so we can see what's going on. Make this grey. And we'll apply this to specific objects. And we can see what we've done is we've created a link between the camera and the material that we're projecting. So if we took off that camera map space warp, it will just naturally project the whole image onto that surface as if it was mapped one-to-one normally. So you need to have both. You need to have that enabled, and you also need to have the texture and the projector linked in here. So if we copy this texture, if we just put the texture in here, then you can see again that we're only going to get, actually 1 second. It might show up in the viewport, but it won't actually render in that way. So if we take a quick render here, and I can show you, because it's like, oh, that's worked, but it hasn't. This is why you need both selected. So if we do a cheeky test render here, we should have this warping and not mapped correctly. Actually, we will just turn off our XREFs because we've only hidden them. So we'll turn them off here so that we can render this quicker. So you can see we've got some strange kind of mapping issues here now, basically. What you also need to do is, so let's turn that back on. So let's put our camera map per pixel back in our model. What you also need to do is the surface subdivision level needs to be of a half decent resolution. So if we display this, all of our objects have got a subdivide modifier on, which, you know, to give it enough level of subdivision that the image isn't going to be distorted. And again, if we kind of click hide subdivision so that we're not actually seeing that detail in the viewport. And you can see that without that, the geometry just doesn't have enough points to reference that camera map. Well, it's not quite as like Zbrush, where it relies on a really dense mesh to kind of camera map, even though it is per pixel. But it still needs a certain amount of subdivision level to display that mesh correctly, basically. So it's a very simple setup to create a kind of projected texture onto your geometry. There's lots of things we can do with that from here. We can either leave it as it is and then render it in, which is kind of what we ended up doing in the post-production, really, because our original intent was to basically make this a V-Ray matte surface material, which meant that the alphas of our shadows would be cut out, so we'd have control over the main Photoshop file image of the background separate to the render. But then we decided, actually, we're just going to render it all in, because we changed the lighting slightly. We wanted that lighting to be reflected slightly more on the photograph. So there's two ways that we can kind of use this now. But I'll show you both methods, even though we went with one, because I think they're both very useful in their own right. And on the second one, which is using the let's find it here, using the material wrapper. is what we use for all of our visual effects when we're comping into actual footage. So I'll show you both methods here now. Okay. Let's just apply this material to the whole model again. Let's just hide these other materials. Let's clone this. And we'll call this material wrap. Call this just cam projection. So the camera projection is going to give us a base image which is being affected by our new lighting. So it's kind of double lighting the image, which isn't really good practice, but for this it worked because we didn't need, we wanted everything to be kind of the same kind of hues, and we didn't want to do separate color correction to the image at the bottom and the render that we were adding on top. And you can see here where the kind of geometry isn't quite lining up to the image, so that would have been a problem. But again, because a lot of our stuff when we X-reference it in hides a lot of that, we weren't too bothered with the details. But yeah, we could go in and make this a lot cleaner and a lot better for our model. But for our purposes, this was a fine base for us to work from, basically. You can see in the alpha here, what we've got in the background is a separate card, which if we swatch that material, we can see we've just got the image which we've kind of cut out the top and created an alpha for, basically. So we have a separate image simply cut out with the alpha that we're using. And this was generated from other pictures as well as similar pictures from here, just to create that edge in our model. There you go. So that's our base, but what if we wanted to render something? Because if we put a box on here now, or anything else, and we want the kind of lighting of that box to kind of affect the shadows on here, but we want to kind of, in post-production, we want to keep our image separate, so we're not lighting it. What we'd need to do is we'd need to wrap this material. So this is our new material wrapper in this Vray material wrapper, and what that is, so keep old material or submaterial. That's essentially going to treat this as a kind of matte object, basically. It's going to treat all the objects that are have this applied to as a matte object. So let's try it just with this one object here that our box is on. And let's see what our options are in this material wrapper. So there's lots of options to change the amount of GI. So basically we can tell it to receive less GI or generate less GI, and this can help a lot with if you have color bleeding issues on things, and generally just the way that the kind of light and the shadows are kind of bouncing onto your object. We tend to leave this on 1 unless there's a problem. Generate caustics, well, it's on by default, but we've got no caustics generated in the scene anyway. And then you've got this matte properties. So we do want this to be a matte surface. That's the whole point of this material. We're turning it to a matte surface. And we want the alpha contribution of this matte surface to be -1. That's because we want our box rendered and visible, but we want the object that it's sitting on to be alpha'd out. And then we have options down here for the shadows and effect alpha. So let's see what these do when we do some render tests. So if I check both of these, let's see what happens when we do a render test of that area. Let's enable our last frame buffer, and we'll do a quick region of down that area so we can see what the difference might be. And if it's done it correctly, we assign that, yeah. So you can see now it's rendered black, but our shadow, we can see that there's more alpha data here. And where this shadow is coming from is the main light. Where all this other color data coming from is from other objects within the scene which are kind of bleeding onto it. So it will kind of take all of the other objects, because remember we've only applied this material to to these roofs here next to us. If we apply it to the whole model, we can still display the material. Then what we get is the direct light of, so anything that's kind of lighter is retaining the alpha, and anything that's kind of darker is going to be kind of like more alphaed out. So this area here, that's like a direct shadow, and that's going to be more visible, and we can use that and grade that separately later. I'll probably illustrate this more in some of the passes that we'll render out with this. So let's just quickly put this on a lower affinity. What's also you have to do, not only do you have to kind of apply this -1 in the alpha of the shadow matte material, you also have to right click and go to the V-Ray properties and select matte objects for reflection, refraction, and there, and you also have to set the -1 there. And again, you're affecting the shadows and the reflection. So we'll close that, and that will apply that to the model. So if we render this again now. I've applied it to my box as well. Let's give that box back into that. And 1 second. So we made our box -1 as well. So we want to uncheck this. So yeah, what we've got, and the reason why this isn't quite black and our contact shadows are not as apparent is because of the GI amount that we've got in the brightness here. So there's a few ways we can kind of deal with this. Let's have a look at this. So we can tell the object to have less GI. We can affect the brightness of our overall effect from our alpha. So if we render that again now, you can see that we're just getting the kind of the contact shadow around it. This is still kind of a matte grey, which is fine, because when we come to use that in post-production, we can kind of use this. But what we're getting here is this sharp line here from the contact shadows, and then the shadows around the object, but then the actual render is rendering completely separately. Now, this is much more used in animation and visual effects. This is not used so much in kind of the generation of still images, and that's kind of why we left it all baked in. So we didn't render our object separately from our background. We rendered everything in. We did some tests, but we decided that was the best workflow for this particular image. But essentially what we'd have then is this would be alphaed out, and then we just plonk it on top, and our shadows would be alphaed, baked into the alpha of that object, but everything else would be kind of alphaed out. Now, what we can also do, which we do more, is if we uncheck alpha, put all the settings back on to 1, and if we, in our V-Ray settings, we add a, let's get rid of all of these. We just add a matte shadow pass. What that's going to do is it's going to give us a completely clean alpha. But in our matte shadow pass, that's where we have our shadow. And we find that this way is a much more reliable way, and you can see the result is much more kind of effective, because your alpha is stronger in the areas you want it to be and not as strong in the other areas it's not in, basically. So then we can use this pass to grade our shadows separately. So we'll have a completely clean alpha. So this is our RGB and our clean alpha. And then we'll have this pass, which we can use as a mask in Photoshop or Nuke, whichever we choose, to then grade on an adjustment layer or levels or curves our image underneath separately. So that's essentially what they're used for. And we find this is the best workflow because it gives us super amount of control in post-production. Whereas when you have this option checked as an alpha, the alpha's burnt in and it's never quite as good, and it's really hard to separate the grade from. So we use this in all of our animations. We could have used it for this image, and I wanted it to highlight the possibility of it. I'll be talking about this a lot more throughout the week because it's quite an important step to take when generating these things. But this is the workflow we prefer, which is having the V-Ray matte shadow separate to everything else. And obviously all this noise is just because of the settings we have here. And you'll find that actually even with high settings, this pass can look pretty aggressive, but it never grades that way. You never get it grading in this way. Whenever you use it, it grades really nice, and you'll see that when I run through some of the other shots. So, but we didn't make this a V-Ray material wrapper. So I'm going to apply this material to everything again. So our geometry, Control A. Apart from our background image, we want that to stay as that image. So there's nothing too special about this lighting-wise. We have a pretty standard workflow that most people adopt these days of using the V-Ray HDRI loader as a within the V-Ray dome. I think what have we got here? We've got one of the Peter Guthrie low sun clouds. We tend to use a range of HDRIs. Our preference is probably CG skies. Just exit this. CG skies are pretty awesome. I'll go to their website now. We buy lots of these. And they have a huge range of very different skies. They seem to be a more dramatic, more varied set of skies that they have than anywhere else, really. They have beautiful cloud ones, and we buy kind of a range of different ones from them, and they give you really great previews on how it reacts to different type of scenes. We buy a lot of these, so these are our kind of preference in HDRIs. They just tend to be a lot more detailed and interesting, and they're all full dynamic. They do tend to be a little bit less consistent. Like each one, you won't be able to necessarily use it with the same settings. It's more kind of custom. Not all of them are available in EXR format. That's partly the problem, but they're very, very good, very, very good skies. So this is loaded in. We've rotated it slightly. We've got the 0.75 in the gamma to increase the shadow intensity. And we've got this on a multiplier of 1, and we control the multiplier in our processing here. So it's pretty standard setup, and that gives us our render. We tend to use I'm not getting anything because it's a matte material still. We tend to use linear multiply. A lot of people use Reinhardt or and things like that, but we kind of use linear multiply. Gives you the most true colors basically. Sometimes with interiors, when your highlights are kind of blowing out on windows, we use Reinhardt, but we tend to control the brightness multiplier here, which kind of gives us a better effect. And so obviously we're in linear workflow, so our gamma's on 2.2, and and obviously all of our gammas here set to 2.2. Obviously they've slightly changed this in Max 2014, but the kind of color mapping options here. And all still images are rendered with a Radiance Map and Light Cache unless we get any funny artifacts, and then we start to use brute force. In the new V-Ray 3, they've increased the brute force speed by 300% or something stupid like that, which is going to be interesting to kind of check out. We might have a look at that on Friday. And I tend to, for optimization purposes, I tend to change the max tree depth and the min leaf size for large scenes. This tends to help with multi-scatter as well. We use multi-scatter, and there tends to be a lot of kind of problems that come with that. Geometry is normally set to auto. If you're using a lot of proxies and you want to put this to dynamic, region is always on 24. Low thread priority just for kind of speed and stopping lag in your machine. I'll be talking a lot more about settings specific for animation on the third day. But yeah, so the actual render image was nothing too special. Let's just do another. Nothing special at all, you can see, because we've got our matte shadow material on. So you can see what difference that is. This is not giving me what I want at all. Whereas when you render it as a separate pass, it really gives you exactly what you want. So you don't want to bake that in really ever. But let's just make that not a matte shadow material. Let's give that. It's actually not a matte shadow material. We've got to change it in the V-Ray settings as well. So they work hand in hand to get a clean result. So again, let's select our geometry, select all, and then go back to the V-Ray properties and turn matte objects off and shadows and effect alpha off, basically. So that's all going to be clean. Okay, we have a question.
It's just it's the first time I see use of material wrapper in terms of how to generate your matte output. Well, I don't quite get the difference between using the wrapper and just doing it directly in the V-Ray properties. Isn't it the same settings there?
I tend to get funny results if I only use one. Basically, I've always been told to use both. If I just use the material wrapper or if I just use the V-Ray properties. I find that you have less. I like using the wrapper because you have lots more control of some of the settings. I would only use the V-Ray properties if I wanted to do it to specific objects while things have the same material, basically, because you don't want to have to create lots of different materials to do just for different objects. I just find it gives me more control. I guess it's just a force of habit to use both at the same time. I'd only use one or the other, like I said, if I wanted to do if I wanted to make certain buildings not react in the same way. Because if I use both and I have some of the objects selected, I do want to bake in the shadows for whatever reason. I can do that. I can so if I have both set as -1, then I can go in and change individual elements as I need to, basically. But still, the material would always be the same.
Paul, how is your starting point to create the camera in this process?
Very, very simple. You put a camera in, face it in a certain direction, and then start building your geometry around that, basically. You make sure the camera was... the thing is, you can't match a camera setting. It's an abstract... In this particular scene, it's an abstract camera setting. So it's very much look and feel, and starting off with the right scale. So we'd roughly know how big these buildings are, so we can start off making a box at 20 meters and position that away from the camera, of a certain distance away. We'd probably start off with a camera which is roughly, the right kind of focal length and things like that. If this was a normal picture, not a kind of panorama, we'd start with exactly the camera setting, obviously, and then you would position your objects relative to that camera, which would be more or less the right accuracy. But with this one, it was very much just put a camera in facing north, and then we what we did do is we kind of positioned a big plane at the bottom. You can see that here, and then we started the camera projection. Oops, I've just moved my camera. We started the camera projection straight away on this plane. And that gave us our position almost of everything, so we could kind of then start building boxes out from that plane in roughly the right locations, and then kind of editing them with edit poly so that they were fixing to the right rooftop heights and things like that. So it's useful to kind of get some. Don't just start with an empty scene. You need to be able to see your image, and you can have that in as a background. But for us, it was easier just to put a plane in, and then you've almost got the physical positions of where these buildings are in your projection, basically. Then you just extrude boxes and then apply the same material to those boxes, and it's a very monotonous but very easy task to achieve once you have that initial setup, basically. And then our background image obviously was kind of in there, and that gave us a bit more of a reference point to how far away these things should be. So, but it's by far and away not a science. It's very much let's make things about the right size, specifically in this case, because of the distorted nature of the camera, basically. That's why I found it quite an interesting one to kind of talk about, because it wasn't just something that you could do with specific settings or specific camera setup. It was very much building things in a kind of very organic way to fit the scene. Does that answer your question? Let's just check. So basically then, checked in the last render, we've actually, buildings are alphaing out. So we've changed something there. Let's just check in here. All the settings are still on -1. Yep. So we'll just return our model to 1, override all, and then we'll be rendering back in, baking in our lighting to our model, to our image, so that the lighting for everything is kind of working the same. Again, this was nothing we would ever do in animation or visual effects, but for the sake of the artwork, it was a speed thing, and it worked just as well, because you could just grade the image separately underneath the layer of your render. So let's have a look at some of these, some of the content that we put in here. So we kind of had 3 different XREFs that were XREF'd in. We had our Jonah sign, which was one of the biggest models, just for one sign. That was kind of the feature of this kind of artwork, really. So we'll let that open. You'll kind of see that here, which kind of appears here. And we had kind of like we had that one separately just because it was so heavy to work with, and it was a bit of a it became a bit of a nightmare. So we had it as a separate model, and then we have a foreground model and a background model. It's as simple as that, really, with the setup. You can see here this sign. It's a big sign. We've had some fun with how we generated the letters. We've got some kind of like lights and wires inside. It's very much. Let's turn on the clipping. Yeah. So again, we don't normally put lights in model files, but with this instance, because we had so many custom things and all these lights were separate, which weren't actually even on in this image, but we had them in there, so we could turn them on whenever we wanted, and they were instanced. So yeah, each letter was kind of designed separately, or as the whole kind of Jonah sign. And then we had the foreground and background models, which were exactly the same models as I showed you in the assets at the beginning. But it just shows how easy it is then, once you have all those assets, just to kind of position them around your scene. So as soon as we had our kind of base model made, then it was really easy to don't want to save that just yet. To kind of position these in a way that was interesting, and it's just a taste and a preference thing to where these things then ended up becoming in the model. We did several iterations of this one before we got to the right kind of composition. We tried lots of different lots of different things. If we turn these on, we can see if we turn on the background, or midground, as it were. And make it visible. For large models, we always put on box, and normally we uncheck cameras and lighting unless there's a lighting model like there is in some of these cases. Let's just let that think about it for a second. So we have our background, which has the Jonah sign referenced in. Again, it's not great practice to have XREFs within XREFs, but in this case, again, it was we wanted that model to be part of that background scene, so it was easier just to kind of have that within the background model, XREF separately in. And we've got the Jonah sign as display as box because it's really heavy, and then we can enable the foreground XREF. Display that. Then when we do a test render here, it'll take a little bit of time. But with our settings, we can kind of get a look and feel for this very, very quickly with the low draft settings and the fixed anti-aliasing. So you can see we've got our shadow of our fish on top of this rooftop, and it's all kind of working quite nicely. So again, this is all baked in, so this is not alphaed out. So already from the render, we've got quite a nice result. We were quite happy with this. We were going to obviously change a few things in Photoshop, but in terms of the level of kind of detail and intricacy and composition, we were quite happy with this. We had a little bit of foreground element. The focus is on the Jonah image. We think the lighting is roughly working quite well. We felt that this area was quite dark, even though that's actually in the photograph. That's not a rendering thing. It kind of looks a bit fake for some reason. When as soon as you make it CG, that element looks too fake, as if like there's not enough, because it's in the day, you expect light to bounce around more. So in post-production, we actually rendered out some separate elements and composited them in just to fill that area up a little bit. It's funny when real life looks more fake than you expect. But so that's basically the scene setup for this. And unless anyone's got any questions, I'll go through the Photoshop for this file in the post-production. So was there any other questions about this file? Cool. Okay, so yeah. Okay, we have a question. Just wait for the mic.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it was strictly lit from the HDRI dome, or did you have a direct light as well?
No, the whole scene is just lit with, as far as I'm aware, let me just double check before I lie. We've got a few lights, but the dome, there's only one of those domes that is actually on. So if we click on any of these lights, it's not actually on. So there's 3 domes in there. They're probably doing a few different things, but the. So look, where are we looking, sorry? There's 3 lights, there's 3 domes basically.
Right, but is your Vray light one with no decay supplemental sign?
Okay, so he's asking whether this Vray light here is actually a sphere light, but it's not actually on. So we probably were playing around with a few options, but no, we decided to go purely with the HDRI dome in the end, rather than any kind of any additional direct light, basically. Yeah. Cool. Okay, well, let's have a look at this in post-production then, this image. Let's open this scene. I'd say there wasn't a huge amount of work that was done in Photoshop for this particular image compared to the other two, but we'll have a little look and see what we did do. Okay, so strip it back to the raw render. So in the render, what I like to do with kind of images in Photoshop is, this is in 8-bit, but let me just see if we have, okay, we don't have the raw render here, but I'll kind of try and illustrate with it, even though this isn't 8-bit. What we'd like to do when we're in 32-bit mode, as soon as we bring in the raw render, is we like to add an exposure. We copy the layer, we add exposure, and we kind of overexpose the scene, basically. And this, obviously, in 32-bit mode, would have a different effect. We then flatten this, and we'll call that over. We still have our original here. We copy that again. We add another exposure. Oops. And we expose it down, and we'll call that under. And what this gives us, then we can now go into we'll then go into 16-bit mode, and it'll give us a lot more depth to play with if we want to paint back in shadows or reduce certain burn of the highlights, which you can't really do to the same level when you're even in 16-bit mode, and certainly not when you're in 8-bit mode. So always while in 32-bit mode, always while in 32-bit mode, create an over and underexposed layer so you can really bring back your levels of your image in areas which might be over bright or areas which are too much shadow. It's kind of like cheating being able to stay in 32-bit mode with at least your raw render pass. So that's just a little trick that we always kind of impose in as soon as we get into Photoshop. That's what we'll do. Obviously, we would have done the usual workflow of loading the files into Stack and bringing all of the render passes and everything in. So the first thing, obviously, is the sky. So yeah, we can see actually our original photograph is pretty clean. And when you use that with a raw render, it can look a little bit fake. So you can see here the color difference, and it's subtle. But we didn't really lose any quality of our photograph by projecting it in. So there was no harm in baking in the lighting and the shadows in this particular instance, basically. But yeah, we added a few kind of cloud elements. I think this is supposed to go like that to kind of like make the image. I think we actually got rid of that one in the end, in the final image. If I can look how we started, yeah, pretty much. And then passes again. Normally, it depends how in detail we go with the passes. Sometimes we go super detailed and we have kind of a lot of really specific corrections. We don't really have like a standard, I guess, workflow. We kind of developing more of a standard workflow within Composite and Nuke, but in Photoshop, as long as people stick to a general order of their layering with the kind of background, render, passes, fog and adjustments and grading and mattes at the top, as long as people stick to that rough structure, then they can kind of do as they will underneath. We don't have like a set template for use your raw lighting or your reflection this way. You need to use all of these passes. It's pretty organic with what we propose, our structure. So all we have here is light select for certain elements which have kind of been boosted, and they're on kind of a soft light, 60%. We have our kind of dirt, which is on multiply on 50. a little bit of reflection, and then raw lighting, again, soft light, 70%. It's probably coming out a little bit harsh there, but we paint that back in later on. Then we have this kind of secondary layer that I was talking about. We've kind of rendered in this structure just to kind of liven up this area down there with a bit more intricacy and detail. We wanted these structures to appear like they were kind of coming out of the fabric and the floor of this area. We didn't want them to feel kind of alien in any way. So again, we have, these were kind of rendered in and composited separately as separate elements. So you can see here, we've got kind of this bottom area, we've got these bar areas, and you've got our some signs that were just composited on afterwards from the pictures. They weren't even rendered in, they were just kind of comped in. Like this bit here, for example, you can see that this has been cut, you know, with the matte ID, so that kind of is behind certain elements. There's another way we could have done that by rendering. If it was rendered in, we could have made our entire model a matte shadow material with an alpha -1, and then that we could have render all these elements behind everything else, and they would have automatically been cut out by our matte shadow element. In this case, especially because it was a still, we could just do exactly the same thing just by selecting some of the mattes. But you can use that multi-matte shadow for rendering in or rendering your mattes. It almost, you know, you're kind of clipping the image if you needed to render additional elements. So that's our structure. And then we've kind of got a fog, which is just obviously the Z depth inverted. Quite a nice trick is to kind of load the Z depth within the mask, and then you can kind of like invert the selection and add that to your actual Z depth layer, which you're kind of cutting out the foreground, and allows you to not have to rely on screen so much. Although this is on screen, it allows you to have it on other blending modes and not have the black affecting the foreground, for example. So that's something that we do sometimes. And then again in paint, there's nothing too special. We've kind of got some hot spots. We're kind of like adding some kind of color variation and some intensity of color in certain areas. We're kind of beefing up the Jonah sign so it's slightly more evident. And then again in the grading, we're just kind of like knocking things back a little bit, bringing the blacks up, yeah, we're not doing anything too special. We're kind of curving the blacks up. We're desaturating it slightly, and then we're adding a slight vignette. So this obviously was not made for a client. This was made for ourselves. So we had a lot more freedom in what we were able to do. This is one of more than 100 images that were created for this 2-month artwork document. So we weren't that interested in being really detailed and specific with the finer arts of painting and really kind of touching up this image. We probably could have spent an extra week, you know, touching up and adding the finer details and painting and highlights and really studying the light and things like that, but it wasn't really necessary. We'd got the message that we needed across. I think with concept art, it's a little bit different. It's got a different kind of end result, and it's a different kind of workflow. Although we did some design iterations, there's not really the iterations that you get with an architect, and it's a very different process. What we kind of also sometimes do is from here, we might take the Z depth separately of this file. If we just kind of like have this on 100% normal, we might take the Z depth and the RGB into After Effects, and we might add some depth of field using Zbrush lift. I can kind of go through that if we like, but it's pretty standard workflow of just using the Zbrush lift attached to the Z depth to create a little bit of blur, and this kind of foreground element here particularly is probably a little bit too sharp for what we need, and it will hide some of the kind of crappy mapping and things like that over here. So Yeah, I mean, again, with the back, but then again, when in these kind of lenses, some people kind of overdo those kind of effects, and sometimes we do too, and we certainly had a little play with specifically in the underwater. So I'll probably show more of that process in the underwater image. But with such a wide-angled lens that we're kind of proposing here, and looking at this distance, you really have to think about what, you know, if we don't want to blur this background or blur the foreground too much, it's going to give it a very unrealistic model effect. You know, these kind of lenses that would take this kind of shot, everything would be super sharp. And again, similar workflow to most people who are using sharpening. We'll kind of like flatten the image and then use the high pass feature. So we can kind of just merge layers and use the high pass to the offset. No, high pass. Sorry, got it wrong. To generate the kind of like subtle lines for the sharpening, and have that on one of 3 blending layers depending on the effect. Normally we like to generate different versions for this. We like to kind of have a kind of soft, medium and large one. So we might have one which is much more, a much larger one on a kind of lower opacity, a medium one on a medium opacity, and a kind of much finer one on a higher opacity. Just to kind of get a little bit more variance, and we might kind of paint in and out of these things, because you don't want to kind of overemphasize this too much. It's just probably about right for the level of sharpening that we'd want for an image like this. But the benefit of the high pass versus a few of the other versions that you can use is that this is a lot less noisy. Specifically, any of the actual sharpening filters or the like the unsharp mask, for example. It gives you a much more of a noise to the image than the high pass does, basically. And it picks up all the artifacting in it if you're using JPEGs, and it's just not a good method to use at all. So typically, once we kind of have our grade, we'll add our we'll have our sharpening right at the top. We might export a flattened version of this with our Z depth to then bring into After Effects and add a little bit of motion, a little bit of blur. We might add a few kind of glows and things like that, but in this particular image we didn't. So that's more or less how that image was composited. So pretty simple. But again, when we're firing out a few of these a day, you have to be quite quick with the post-production. As long as it's all done in a certain way and it's kind of giving us the feel that we want and it's telling the story that we want, then we can move on. So this was pretty straightforward. Was there any questions about this image at all? Great. So let's look at one of the underwater scenes. So we kind of had a nice and a rubbish version of all the scenes. Again, it was kind of telling that in the artwork. It was telling that story of the old and the new. So if we look at the artwork, we can see that we did that for the underwater as well. We kind of had the old underwater, which was kind of all lush and green with coral and trees and seaweed and all sorts of other nice things. And then that literally gets replaced compositionally with boats, rubbish, and the like. So it was kind of, again, you can see some of the boat models that we looked at earlier and how they kind of look in the artwork. And it has that, again, that Dynamesh technique worked really well on some of these things, and then adding detail with our multi-scatter here. So we have a kind of a nice and a rubbish version of all the models. I'll open up one of the nice ones. (2014). Again, it was a very similar task. I quite liked the idea of creating these really long, more panoramic underwater images, and really tell more of a landscape story with the images, and juxtaposing that with this kind of vertical poster that we did that tried to tell the whole story. So it kind of mixed it up a bit. It mixed up the document that we created, and I think they worked quite well to in that kind of format where you're kind of, because initially we had all these kind of tall structures and it made sense to do things kind of a bit more vertically or even square. Square images are sometimes quite nice. But we ended up kind of choosing a very early on in this phase when we were compositing a kind of a much wider format image for the artwork. And it also made it feel very different spatially to some of the town stuff that we were doing, which existed in lots of different formats, from portrait to square to more landscape. But this was kind of as far as we went with the kind of the landscapeness. So it gave it a very different feel because we wanted to tell the story of the town, but also the area where the fish lived was very important. So it was really kind of making these two areas juxtapose each other in a nice way. So we can see here, this is our composition, very similar to the kind of setup of the street scene in the fact that we had a huge library of stuff, and now it's just a case of actually putting a camera in that scene, getting a camera kind of like angle and kind of working well with the right kind of camera settings, and then just literally having some fun with placing all of the different elements. And I think the artwork was really, the different shots we created were just the different shots where those, so you kind of have this one here, if I'll make this one smaller. There was 3 main shots that we worked on for the underwater. And it was just playing with those models until they really suited the scene compositionally. Some of them were more dynamic than others, and actually the simpler ones kind of worked almost better, really. I felt like this bottom one here was one of the more successful compositions, which kind of worked nicely on the kind of rule of thirds and using the golden mean. And the other two, this one was a bit more kind of like stylistic in its kind of camera angle. This one was the first one we did, and this went through a few different iterations before we got it right. And then we really got the workflow down in this image before kind of repeating the same process with these two. So what's different about this scene? We know how the rocks were created. We know that there's a few of them. There's 2 rocks here, particularly that have the multi-scatter technique with the masks that we made, scattering our detail onto it, which was specifically important for this scene, for this particular camera, because it was very close and not the resolution that I wanted for the map. So I didn't really get the detail back in the model, so I had to hide a lot of that with the multi-scatter, like I was saying. However, what we've got here, which is different, is this bed. So I'll open that in a separate scene, which is quite interesting. This was kind of like this kind of coral bed, which had different kind of scatter maps in different areas, which created this huge variance in the kind of foliage of the scene, really, the kind of like the folly of the scene. So if I open this scene up and take a poke around. So we've got our bed. Let's just have a look which bed scene it is XREF'd in. Let's close Photoshop panel. Check our XREFs in our camera file. Bed 2 and grass 1. So we had to create this kind of huge groundscape for these underwater images, and we wanted it to work both foreground and background. So it was kind of probably for the time we had quite a good way of working, but if we had a bit larger time, we probably would have tried to optimize a few things. But essentially with the bed, what we have is this, let's turn off some of the multi-scatter so we can use this file a little bit better. It's a little bit lighter because it's again a very heavy scene. We find with multi-scatter, like any kind of scattering software, there's this kind of sweet spot really that I think, and there's a few settings I wouldn't mind touching upon once we can find our multi-scatters. Let's just try and select them in here. Okay, they're hidden up there. So basically the same process in Zbrush kind of happened with this base geometry. So we created this kind of like rough base, which was kind of just modeled in Max with a basic plane, certain shape, certain kind of in edit poly mode, like holes were kind of cut out of that plane, and then it was kind of turbo smoothed and, or it was shelled and turbo smoothed. And then we kind of deleted further elements. So it was very simple to make. And then we basically imported that into Zbrush, gave it a base texture, and we did the same process. We painted on all the top faces a black mask, and we used that to then scatter our multi-scatter coral and foliage and that kind of thing, basically. So for this kind of work, that workflow works really well. And then what we have is we have a kind of proxied version of that object, so Vray proxy, and we have that all around it, which kind of works. For those of you, I'm not going to show you how to create a proxy, but for those of you who don't know the kind of technology behind it, it basically allows the mesh to only be processed if a bucket is actually rendering it. So it doesn't matter how many of these things are in your scene, you can have them behind the camera everywhere. We wanted to create a patch that kind of worked, that we could move around, or even kind of link to a dummy in the camera file and move about specifically. So we created a very large surface, and we didn't really care if some of it wasn't visible by the camera, because the processing power when rendering doesn't matter when you have proxies, basically. So we don't have obviously our scatter on all of this. It's just the bare kind of bones of that structure. And then what we have are several models that we made, which are again proxied out. So let's hide these guys. So these are just proxied coral models. Some of them are some of the really elaborate, bigger trees that we made, but more smaller kind of decimated versions of them that would work at a smaller scale. Because obviously some of these were made at super high resolution to exist as much more prominent features. So we had to kind of decimate them to make them work. But there were lots of different iterations of designs that were kind of really sketched out. They didn't have to be too detailed. And then some more kind of grassy elements that were constructed, all in just in Zbrush, to give ourselves a library of assets to then scatter with, basically. And you can see these. You can see these here. This one's a little bit dodge, but some of the other ones are okay. One thing that we did try and do, which is kind of more evident in like this one here, is we had a fall off in the diffuse, so that when it rendered, you kind of got this blue glow around it, which really helped. You can see it here as well. We didn't do it on all of them, but on some of them, it really helped give it that kind of watery feel, that underwater feel, having the kind of color correction in the diffuse of a fall off, basically. So on the front material, you've got the main material, and then on the kind of fall off side, the black side, you've got a color corrected blue version of that same material. Let's just see if that's still on this model. I haven't checked. But it's quite a nice way to kind of give the illusion of more of a kind of watery watery global illumination almost. Let's let this load. Not responding. You can see here that material and what it's doing is that you're using the same material just with a kind of blue glow on the outside, and it was something we did on lots of the underwater materials. So it's the same map, just with a hue tint, with the saturation levels up, and the strength of that tint is 100%.
Could you use this technique for other effects? Say like, I don't know, fog, or can you think of other times you could use this technique?
I think you can use it to create more, if you wanted more of anything on the kind of outside of a material. I think that's the point. More reflection, more glow, more. You could do it with a kind of the secondary material. You could have a Vray light material to have kind of. That's how you create a lot of the neon signs. We did it with a very similar kind of effect where you're kind of having a stronger light around the outside of a material and less of more of a glass at the front. So you have kind of a glass at the front and then a light at the back, and that creates more of a neon light effect. I think we use that. We use the fall off for quite a lot of things. It's not just a default glass technique. Basically, you can use it to create lots of different effects. I can't think of any others specifically. I think it's just. I think the point is just more of something that you want on the outside surface of your models, basically, whatever that might be. Cool. Okay, so we've got all of our models. We're scattering them in the same way that we did the other stuff that we showed you. So it's just essentially linked to the displacement, which is on here. And we've got the same process where we haven't actually used the normals on this one. Remember the last time I showed you that the normals were pointing in the same faces as the model, so it's referencing the model. But on this one, on this particular one, we didn't, because we had the all of the kind of grass growing in directions we didn't necessarily want them to grow in. We could have this effect less. It's not just 1 or 0. We could have this effect on point 2 or whatever, and then we're kind of changing the direction of these coral pieces. So if we put that on 1, then it's hard to tell when they're displayed as box, but we have objects that are kind of facing in the wrong way, basically, that we really need, because this is more of a kind of upward facing bed that we were creating that happens to be scattered on this object. So we didn't really need it to be to work on the normal scale, but we normally do have that on there. Obviously, we've got some variation in the scale in our multi-scatter. Yeah, one thing with multi-scatter is also this auto-update feature, and that's great sometimes, but sometimes it can really slow down your scene because it's kind of constantly reading from those settings. We've done a project recently, which was a project in space, and we had a huge multi-scatter system set up there, and we had to, especially working with XREFs, we had to turn off auto-update in all of the scenes to be able to work with the files. But that means that you won't be able to, what this limits you is that if that scene is XREF'd, you won't be able to then move that scene with a dummy in a camera file. So that if you want to be able to move your scene with a dummy in the camera file, then that has to be on. Otherwise, the multi-scatter element within that scene will become static when you move it. And I'm always moving around XREFs in specific files. And we did a lot for this one as well, because we wanted the the cameras in certain locations, and we could move things around, but then sometimes it was just easier within files to just drag this bed around wherever you needed it to be. So that's why they're all on auto update, but just be aware of what that does. Collision is an interesting thing. We tend to, I find that the most solid parameter for this is always 50%. And what this does, if this isn't selected, you can get crashes. Multi-scatter doesn't deal with intersecting geometry very well, and this kind of avoids that. So it kind of gives everything a bit more of an awareness. It allows multi-scatter to know where the objects are and if they're kind of colliding with each other. So the kind of this parameter, along with obviously the main kind of max count setting, is really the ones that you want to be tweaking to kind of not get crashes and overloading your scene. Also, another tip, multi-scatter has the, and I've had this with Forest Pro as well, that the gizmo sometimes duplicates itself. This is like a known issue with multi-scatter, and it can, I don't know if any of you have had the rendering instances error in Max, but essentially what that is, it can be in numerous things. It can be one of your objects you're scattering with. It doesn't like it. We had that a lot with the rubbish files, where half of the rubbish that we made just wouldn't work in any scattering technique at all. It just didn't like it. No matter how much you collapsed or reset your X form, it just didn't like it. So that's a weird thing. It's probably something to do with the decimation levels. When you take a nice model and you decimate it, something always goes wrong. There's always overlapping geometry somewhere, and sometimes it just doesn't like it. So yeah, that can be one issue for the instancing problem. The other one is that if you've got multiple multi-scatter objects in the same scene, and sometimes if you've instanced your geometry and then you've got that attached to a different multi-scatter, it sometimes doesn't like that. So that's something to be aware of. Thing is, there's no reason to ever really instance a proxy in my mind, because you can. They're all referencing one mesh, and unless your proxy is heavy, but if you want to be optimized, you just display as box. For me, there's no reason why you necessarily have to have multiple of the same proxy anyway. But if you do need to do that, then just do it as a copy. And the third thing is that multi-scatter can randomly duplicate itself, and you just have to be sure that you've only got the amount of multi-scatters in your scene that you want. Because even recently, we've had it on a standard architectural visualization project where we were creating some foliage, and we got that error in every file, and it was driving us crazy until we did some research. And it was it can sometimes copy itself, which sounds bizarre, but be aware of that as well. We didn't go into any detail with kind of like having any kind of variance in the rotation or creating any kind of effects like that. Multi-scatter supports animated objects, obviously, which we had in some case, but not for the artwork. So everything else was relatively standard. There's a little bit of rotation variation. There's no movement variation. So yeah, that was pretty easy to set this up and just be aware of the issues that scattering things has. So that's pretty much the bed, and we had a similar kind of setup with the grass. And what the grass is, it's the invert of that. So that same mesh we created, we've got an invert of that mesh, and we did a similar kind of thing. We didn't actually. There was no need to really import this into Zbrush. This was just let's turn off these multi-scatters for a second. We just have a kind of standard shape that we've kind of played around with, and we've kind of this is obviously the invert of the other thing. So we kind of like detached faces from our previous selection of our inverted model that we made and extracted that. And we're kind of shelling that. We're adding our turbo smooth. And then we might be tweaking a few things here and there, and then UV mapping it and box mapping. Pretty simple. Because this was going to be covered, so there was no need for this to be hugely detailed. This is just adding, so in between all of this, we've got our coral. And then using this surface, we've now got our grass, basically, which is, again, was modeled in a similar way and then optimized. So we've got a few different varying kind of grass and greenery that we're using here. And some bushy elements. And this was worked with in the exact same way, except that we've got a little bit of border behavior, because it was kind of scattering on the edges and kind of acting a little bit strange. So we kind of put the border on so it wasn't going to affect any of our meshes, and it also allowed us to see our coral structures a little bit more. Again, variance, so there was nothing too different about this than any of the other files. So back to our scene setup. So we have all of our elements. We have our bed, we have our rocks, and then it's just about compositing that in a kind of like, or rather, positioning all of these elements in a nice way. So again, like we said, all of these models have got low poly and a high poly. So we have the box is the high poly proxy, and then the representation of that is the kind of low poly kind of decimated version, just for the viewport for us to see positioning. But the high poly one is in exactly the same location, and it just allows us to be able to do this basically. Because if we had all the high polys in here, we would no way be able to kind of like navigate around like this. Obviously with the multi-scatter on, it makes things a lot slower as well, so we can turn that off if we want to kind of position the scene, or just work with the rocks or whatever. So the lighting for this scene, well, I will show you the technique for projecting the caustics, but we didn't actually do this for this scene. After we did the artwork, we did a render test, and I'm not sure I've got it with me, but we did end up using the caustics for that render test, basically. So let's just see if I've got it anywhere. Animation test. Let's see which one this is. This was when we were still thinking that we were going to do the underwater ourselves, because just to kind of, for those of you who don't know, in the main film, which we'll show in full on Friday night as a closing thing, was the underwater was made by Jellyfish Pictures, basically, who are another visual effects studio in London. So we did the artwork and the design and the previs of everything, and then when it came to the visual effects, we did all of the town stuff, and they did all of the fish and the underwater stuff. So it's going to be a little bit jerky on our playback on the feed, but you can kind of see here that the Caustics is working quite well, and that's all generated through a projected light. It's not actually, so this is the kind of breakdown. This is that's raw render. So we baked in the kind of the Z depth effect using the Vray environment fog, and then we're adding a few bits of particles where the light hits. So we had separate render passes for kind of just where the light was, so we could specifically mask kind of particle effects where the light was. And then we had our projection light of our caustics, which again we had as a separate light select, which we could beef up in post. But you can really see the kind of some of the effect of the fall-offs and things like that. But for us, it wasn't. I mean, then the rocks look quite nice there, but it wasn't the level we wanted for this film. This wasn't the level of composite. It's difficult because we were working in full CG, and in reality, the kind of post-production for this was always going to be based on real footage, which gives you 50% head start. So this test was useful to know our limitations. This was an immensely heavy scene, but it was good to test out the kind of workflow for doing the kind of underwater tests. So we'll have a look at some of the techniques of this. The water was all just an animated displacement modifier, and that was used in the poster image. So we'll talk about that in the breakdown of that in a second. But we'll have a little go at the kind of caustics and see if we can rebuild that, and see how, just show you how simple it is basically. So just to kind of cap on the settings for this. We kind of broke the rule a little bit here. Normally we leave this on 1, but that's on 35 for whatever reason. If we take our underwater HDRI, we bought the Dosh underwater HDRIs, and it's funny because although it doesn't really look like an underwater render as you might think, the light is in the right place. I think that's the most important thing when looking at the kind of raw renders of these things, is that the light is a soft diffused light as if it was coming through water. You know, it kind of reacts in a certain way. It's got it's a very different HDRI to say a sky HDRI, which reacts in a very different way. So the most important thing for us wasn't necessarily the kind of color effect. It was more the fact that the light and the kind of soft shadows of things were going to react properly. That was why it was important to kind of use these kind of HDRIs where you get this kind of overall effect, and then the mid ground and lower ground are much darker, or the kind of, it's just a different effect to what if you just plonked an exterior HDRI in there. So these are the Dosh underwater set, and again, there's nothing too special about how this is set up. So we can pretty much move into post-production for this image, and then we'll go and show how that caustic effect worked in the previous test. So let's close him down. Let's open up our underwater test 1. Let's try this. Yep. Okay. See if this is sorted out. Not sure this is the file. Let me just check this is the right file. Okay, let's just go with this one. Okay, so what we have here is let's turn all of this off and find our raw render. Turn our grading off. So essentially, this is our raw render with our alpha cut out. And kind of, you could argue that could look like an exterior scene, an exterior lighting setup. But if you look closely, you've got a very different kind of effect going on with the kind of blue edges from the lighting. And although there's no caustics in this scene, you believe that it's kind of lit in a different way. Like the underside of surfaces are more blue, but the overall image looks a bit flat, basically. But we knew we were going to kind of heavily post-process this image, so we weren't too bothered about that. Again, the main issue for me was the resolution of these edges, which never kind of returned back from Zbrush. So for me, it was kind of dealing with that. Likewise, I think we mentioned several times how we would deal with that if we were to do that again. And also, some of the multi-scatter is a little bit intersecting. We want to kind of paint that out a little bit. But mainly it's talking about the look and feel, because again, this wasn't. This was mainly to communicate a space and an environment designed for the film. So start off just by painting in the kind of background and give it some kind of gradient, basically. Looked at lots of different reference photographs for kind of like the peaks of the lighting through the water, which kind of roughly matched what we were doing. Stick that back on 30%. And then a lot of these layers underneath the render are just kind of like paint layers and images that we've used to kind of like give the effect that we wanted. Again, our exposure is above our render there. It's kind of generally brightening all of our dark areas. We have our dirt layer here, which is significantly changing the image quite a lot, for the worse or for the better. This is our raw lighting layer. So you can see what this is doing here. We're kind of painting that out in certain areas where we don't want it. But that's really adding to the kind of, making the image a lot less flat, boosting the kind of the ground a little bit, darkening the shadows, lighting the highlights, painting in manual kind of adjustments. Again, that's kind of bringing out some of the coral elements. And then this is the kind of technique I was talking about, where you're using the Z depth to mask itself, but an inversion of itself. So you essentially, you'll do a select all of the Z depth, you'll copy it, and you'll paste it in your channels, and then you'll simply invert that in the mask, and then that gives you the Z depth, but masked out in the foreground, so then you can then color correct that bit slightly separately, and it's a different workflow than just screening something on. This is on color, for example, because we don't want to darken our foreground with the black of that inversion. So we kind of have that bluing effect at the background. And again, we're kind of neutralizing some of the darkness, the contrast, using the Z depth again on normal. And again, you wouldn't be able to use the Z depth on normal if you didn't cut out the foreground. So it's a useful little effect. Bang, that's a bit of a difference, isn't it? And then grading, obviously, let's just delete the layers we're not using so we don't get confused. So the main one, obviously, we've got a huge color balance on here, which is making the midtones more blue, the shadows more cyan and slightly more yellow, and then our highlights much more cyan, basically, and just with a hint of magenta. So that's kind of what we're doing with our color balance there, and that's really making it look already a lot more convincing as an underwater image. Again, we're kind of unifying it a little bit more. We did a lot of kind of references into kind of like how everything works. In reality, this wouldn't really work, because this is what we found when we went to shoot it, is that the visibility underwater is nowhere near what we're proposing here, and that was one of the kind of fading ambitions of the project, that we were never able to get the kind of epic scale of the underwater that we wanted to, that kind of rivaled what we were doing in the town in the final product, because the visibility of water just wasn't anywhere near what we kind of wanted it to be. So in underwater, you kind of, everything retains their color quite well, up to a few meters, but then after a few meters, everything becomes instantly blue. So we're kind of adding a bit more kind of graded color correction there, basically. Painting wise, again, delete the layers we're not using in this scene. Painting wise, we're kind of adding a bit of flair, and there's lots of ways you can do this. I mean, a way we always do it, which seems to be quite popular, which is to let's have a look. Let's do it on a new layer. Let's use our brushes. Let's just use a hard brush. The way I like to do it is to draw lines of varying thicknesses. I might copy that a few times. Then I'll just merge those together. Position it roughly how I want it to go. Using distort. It's kind of flaring out, obviously, rather than in. And then I just filter that with a where am I going? Start blur, sorry. With a motion blur, and I'll just kind of like crank that right up until it gives me the effect that I want. And then I'll just simply paint that out wherever I don't want it. And I might grade it to be slightly different color or with a softer brush. And you can use this obviously wherever you've got light coming through a small space. It's not to be kind of overused. People overuse these effects a little bit. I want it kind of shining in a nice way and catching through bits of hole there. That's quite nice. It's being a bit more subtle with it, but giving you the effect that you want. Bit more extreme than what we had here. That's kind of just a bit more subtle, but you get the idea. Generate that stuff very quickly. We have multiple versions of these, some stronger lines than others, some more subtle. You've got this kind of harsher vignette there. Again, most of that was to focus the image really intensely in this middle bit and hide some of the dodgy modeling up there. And then here I'm kind of grading the kind of edges of things more. So you can kind of see there on what that layer is doing. It's actually a paint layer, which is on color. And that's just kind of like giving the edges of things a bit more. It's like extending that effect I was doing in 3D, but in a 2D version, basically, of the kind of fall off on the edges of things. It's just kind of adding to that effect. And then here I'm just lightening this edge. So you can see that kind of makes a big difference to the final result. And then this would then be flattened and then brought into After Effects. And then all we're doing here is we're adding chromatic abrasion and blur. And we're using the blur from the Z depth. It's very easy to kind of set that up. So we're using Magic Bullet and Fresh Lift to create a simple chromatic abrasion and blur effect, basically. So there's a temptation to kind of use Magic Bullet for kind of really extreme looks. But I think with this one, it was the look was created in Photoshop, and there wasn't a temptation to kind of overgrade it afterwards in anything else, adding to that process. So from that kind of base layer here, again, this also helped to kind of blur some of the kind of little geometry nooks in there. So we're adding after that we can continue adding a few elements like fish and dust. And the dust is what is again very simple to kind of achieve. It's just images of dust on color dodge layer, and we're kind of painting it out. And we have several layers which kind of give a kind of finer detail and a larger detail, just like you would with a rain effect. You'd have several layers of it communicating a different distance. Same with dust. You have like or kind of water particles, whatever you want them to call them, that you kind of see in underwater. So that was pretty much the kind of setup there, and we only really had one object ID for this one. There wasn't really any need to go any more complicated than that. So yeah, you can very easily go from there to there with a few painting and grading techniques, basically. So let's look at the how to use the caustic effect in a really quick way. First of all, you need a caustic map. The best way of doing that is the Caustic Generator. This is really cheap. This is really easy. You can try it for free. You can use it here. There's tutorials on how to use it, and it's really great for creating, exporting seamless, repetitive caustic maps. It's like a looping effect, basically. So you can see what it's doing there. It's very nice. So once you have your map, which I'm hoping I do, sure I do somewhere. We can see what it looks like. We'll bring it into, I think it's in our textures. Let's have a look in here somewhere. So underwater, Caustic Generator, and what we've got here is a sequence of images that I exported in a certain setting to give me that effect. So if I load that into After Effects, exported it as EXR and BMP files. So let's import the EXRs sequence, see what that's doing. And it's decent resolution. The free version, you're limited by the resolution. The version that you buy, you're not limited by that. And you can use this wherever. It doesn't have to be an underwater crazy scene like this. You know, you can use this in a kind of an animation for a pool or in a kind of architectural scene where you've got water. Anywhere where you get your water, you can kind of use this map that you're generating and somehow using it to project. And the way you kind of project it, if we start with a fresh new scene. Let's just create a, actually let's take a scene, let's take a scene I built earlier on. Let's take a max scene from here. So we've got a pre-built model. Move the camera here, let's go back. How this works is that you can put it in a direct light. Let me see, you can load any textures within the Vray lights, but I like to control how this works within a direct light set to Vray shadows. So if we just put a target direct in the scene, and then in there we can control our texture. If we put it in advanced effects, we can use the projector map basically. So we'll load our bitmap within there. Let's find our texture again. Underwater, Caustic Generator, let's load our EXRs sequence. Now, we're exposed for a proper scene here, so let's just go into our camera. Let's work into screens. So let's just set this up for a quick test. Let's just keep testing until we get the right intensity of this effect. Before we do that, we obviously have to put this on Vray shadow. Click on shadows. And let's just play with this. Normally you have to stick lights on at least 30 to show up as in the properly exposed scenes. Let's just quickly get this working on 2 lights. Let's do a quick test render and see what that looks like. Not to the back burner though.
You're going to have to click the little black arrow on the bottom right corner there. Next to render. No, when you're ready to click that, and switch to production.
Oh, I've got it. I've got it in art. Oh no, Art scene.
Yeah, they removed, if you said you're using 2012, they removed that little check flag for network render.
Okay.
So if you have it enabled in Odin in 2013 or 2014, it defaults, and you have to switch it back to production for it not to do that. And then now to submit to network render, you have to manually click that little block arrow every time.
So one of the guys in the class was just saying that the network rendering option in 2012 has been 2014 has been removed, and you have to activate production render mode to kind of get that feature back. It's not rendered by default to back burner, which is mental. Okay. So we can see that we've got some effect. It's clearly not what we need it to be yet, but the principle works. So we're projecting our light through this thing here. Now, what we might want to do is take that texture, plonk it in there, then play around with this tiling to be on like maybe 5 and 5. Let's just check our other light is linked to our HDRI. It's missing the map, let's just relink that. Just see if we can do this in the okay, we're in there for now without the main HDRI. Let's just so we can see the light effect of our Caustics map. So you can see here now by tiling that image, you've got the Caustics to kind of spread across the model. And if you only want this in certain areas, you just play around with the fall off of the light. You could have the light pointing upside down if it's coming from a pool or a water source, and it's kind of facing in a different direction. So let's just play around with the in the kind of settings of here. So let's change this a little bit. By default, I always put overshoot on. Oh no, do I? No, I think that's if you want it to be infinitely everywhere in the kind of Z direction of the light source. See what difference that makes. Yeah. So in this case, we don't want overshoot on, because what that's going to do is it's going to everything outside of our light is also going to be overshot with pure light, which isn't actually using our Caustic Generator map. So if we turn that on and we see the difference of that. You can see everything outside of our fall off zone is also lit, but without the map, and it's giving it complete brightness, as opposed to this, which is exactly what we want. We've got this fall off effect. We can decrease or increase where the effect of that Caustics happens now. I think this will only work with water. Obviously, I don't. If you wanted these kind of glass spheres to react properly with Caustics, you'd have to enable that within the Caustics settings and do it more manually. But this is just a technique that is very fast for generating water Caustics to use even in underwater scenes like we did, or to in and around kind of areas with like a lot of water and lighting, like pool shots and things like that. So again, I think you just have to be creative with how you might use this. I think you can definitely kind of like try using it from plane lights, using the map within plane lights. Try it kind of pointing upwards into your scene from the pool source. I think there's all sorts of ways where it can potentially be used. I think the main one is if you had a pool in here and you wanted caustics on the kind of ceiling and just slightly around the edges, then it would be great to use that technique for that, basically. So let's just decrease this effect further, have a play around. And this is animating. This is an animated map that we've got in here. So you can see it's on this narrow plane now, which probably isn't what we want, because it's projecting the overshoot is on, and it's projecting the edges. So overshoot is off, and it's giving us that soft edge again. And combined with other lighting, that would give you the effect that you want. So, were there any questions until we move on to the third poster image on this process? Okay, let's have a 15-minute break until we move on and talk about the final image.